everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Sabiha Rahman.
And I'm Walter Ruby.
I am an American Muslim.
And I'm an American Jew.
And we refuse to be enemies.
We absolutely do.
Since the outbreak of the war in Gaza, Muslim-Jewish relationships in America have fallen apart.
Well, for the most part.
Yeah, for the most part.
And we see it as our sacred responsibility to work to knit these relationships back together. Not an easy task, but a vital one.
Now, like interfaith activists across the country, Walter and I have been engaged in Muslim-Jewish dialogue for decades. In the years following 9/11, we drew on our commonalities and our relationships flourished. However, each time a conflict erupted in Israel-Palestine, there was a pullback from Muslim-Jewish engagement in the US. By some, but not all. Each side went quiet, each side feeling awkward and not wanting to offend the other. And then there was a coming back, by most, but not all.
However, at no time has there been such a strong pulling back, marked by mutual recriminations and countervailing charges by each community against the other, as contributing to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, as we've seen during the current Israel-Gaza conflict. Today, we stand divided. But now more than ever, we sense an urgency in driving home our message of the preciousness of Muslim-Jewish alliance here in America.
That's right. We are Americans first, and whereas we care deeply about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we live here, not there. And if we want to preserve democracy and pluralism here at home, our faith communities need to stick together.
As American Jews, Muslims, and allies, we must not allow the conflict in Palestine and Israel to irreparably tear apart our alliance here at home in America, as it is now tragically threatening to do. We love and respect each other and are committed to standing up for each other if either community is under attack, as both presently are, amidst alarming spikes in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes. And this is what we believed in April 2021 when we launched our book, published our book, We Refuse to Be Enemies, How Muslims and Jews Can Make Peace One Friendship at a Time. And this is what we believe every bit as passionately today. There is literally no time to lose.
So with that premise, we start off these series with getting to know one another, as in Muslims and Jews. As a first step, we need to understand how each side views the conflict and its impact on Muslim-Jewish relations here at home. Hopefully, all of us will listen intently to the perceptions of the other. That means stepping out of our comfort zones, out of our respective silos, putting aside, to the extent possible, our tribal instincts, and hearing and comprehending where the other's pain is coming from. Then we can allow our hearts to expand. Walter, tell us how members of the Jewish community feel about the response of American Muslims to the conflict.
Sure, Sabia. So the Jewish community feels that Muslim leaders have not gone far enough to denounce Hamas for its brutal, life-destroying rampage against 1,200 Israelis, including some 1,000 civilians, on October 7th, the deadliest one-day spasm of anti-Jewish violence since the Holocaust.
And Muslims are resentful at being pressured to speak out against Hamas's actions when they feel that there has been relative silence by many Jews over the oppression Palestinians have endured for decades under Israeli occupation. American Muslims also feel dread at the new wave of Islamophobia. Nearly half of Muslim families with schoolmate children are facing bullying by classmates and teachers. 3 young college students were shot in Vermont, and a 6-year-old boy in Illinois was stabbed 27 times, stabbed to death, just for being a Palestinian.
So terribly tragic. And many Jews for their side, feel threatened by the dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents across the US, including at so many pro-Palestinian rallies on college campuses since the fall. Many Jewish students report having been, quote unquote, canceled by former friends, fraternities and sororities, and other campus institutions, including in some cases professors, for daring to affirm that they remain Zionists or care for the well-being of Israel. And pro-Israel Jews have been especially alarmed in recent weeks to see the spreading of pro-Palestinian demonstrations to campuses across America.
Speaking of pro-Palestinian protests on campuses across America, riot police have been called upon to break up peaceful pro-Palestinian protesters, and students have been beaten, arrested, and detained. In one incident at UCLA, counter-protesters hurled stones, incendiary objects, and 2x4s at the pro-Palestinian protesters, and the police took no action. Muslims feel that they are being targeted for their pro-Palestinian position. The cancellation of a valedictorian speech at the University of Southern California is one example. They question whether a similar stifling of expression and aggressive crackdown would have happened if they were opposing a humanitarian crisis, say, in Africa or Europe. And you know what? No congressional hearings were called when students were doxxed, harassed, and bullied.
Even many Jews who oppose Israel's military incursion into Gaza as massive overkill that has taken far too many lives are nevertheless angered by the widespread description of Israel's military response by many Muslim and pro-Palestinian leaders as quote unquote genocide. Jews feel strongly that Israel's invasion was precipitated by the brutal Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, and that it is deeply wrong-headed and even anti-Semitic to charge that the faith community that was attacked and which endured the Holocaust is now itself carrying out a genocide. And that's especially the case because Hamas, the murderous force which carried out the massacre and still calls for Israel's destruction, remains in power in Gaza. The charge of genocide against Israel triggers in Jews a sense of isolation, vulnerability, and betrayal by the world, compounded by the growing fear among many Jews that Israel's very existence may be at risk.
Many in the Muslim community question the fairness of our government's unconditional support of Israel with no accountability. They see double standards in how our leaders address Israeli and Palestinian issues. They see mainstream media as being one-sided, elected officials downplaying the disproportionate loss of life of over 37,000 civilians in Gaza, including over 20,000 women and children. The physical infrastructure of Gaza, including housing, razed to the ground, causing 90% of the 2.2 million Gazans to become refugees, and the Gazans' desperate call for a permanent ceasefire being ignored. Muslim leaders feel that the still prevailing pro-Israel zeitgeist in America makes it unsafe for them to speak up for the Palestinians or risk being labeled anti-Semites or supporters of terrorism. The censure of Congressman Rashida Tlaib is just one example.
Okay, and one last point from the Jewish side. Pro-Israel Jews are alarmed to see that Israel's critics have multiplied greatly since October 7th within the Democratic Party, which is, after all, the home of most American Jews. So now it's not only the squad, but more mainstream legislators like Senator Bernie Sanders, himself Jewish, and Chris Van Hollen from my home state of Maryland are pushing for resolutions making continued U.S. aid to Israel, military aid to Israel, conditional on not being used in ways that violate human rights. There's true, some left-wing Zionists like J Street, the liberal counterpart to AIPAC, and myself as well, have supported the Van Hollen Initiative. But it is fair to say that the overall pro-Israel community, including many liberals, feels isolated and stigmatized in a way that has not occurred for many decades, probably since the run-up to the 1967 war.
One last point for me. I cringe each time I hear Palestinians being referred to as terrorists. After all the terror that Palestinians have endured, starting with the Nakba and over the last 75 years, living in fear of being raided and hurled off to jail, families burned to death after right-wing settlers torched their homes, and now over 1 million living in terror of being wiped out. Can we justify calling them terrorists? But somehow the label has stuck, and the terms Palestinian and terrorists are used interchangeably, almost as a given. Understand how that makes us feel.
Sabia, I'm sure there's a whole lot more that we could talk about how each side is feeling in these awful moments. That was just the overview. But let's now take the dialogue to the next level. So if I were to ask you, Sabia, as a pro-Palestinian Muslim, what do you want from the Jewish community? What do you expect of them?
Great question. I would want the Jewish community to understand how much the plight of the Palestinians and justice to them means to us. Understand how much it hurts us to see Palestinians living under occupation, the blockade of Gaza, the controls on what goes in and out of Gaza, demolition of homes in Jerusalem, checkpoints in the West Bank, administrative detentions, what it is like to live in daily humiliation, robbed of freedom and dignity, seeing their lands being taken over by settlers, living as second-class citizens in Israel, and the dehumanization of Palestinians, all of which has escalated since October 7. It hurts. I am not asking American Jews to solve the problem, but to acknowledge and understand our pain.
For their part, Jews expect American Muslims to condemn Hamas, just as they once did Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as a moral abomination and a desecration of Islam. We're dismayed when that doesn't happen. So let me share one example, a personal example. A prominent imam who has been at the heart of Muslim-Jewish coalition building, I'd say since 2008, said nothing about October 7th after it happened, after that terrible event happened. So I spoke to the imam's closest associate about a week after that, and I asked him whether the imam could issue a public statement denouncing what happened on October 7th as a desecration of Islam. And I was stunned when the response from the associate, who's a dear friend of mine, was saying, he said, no, sorry, the imam can't do that. Why not? I asked. He said, well, considering the huge civilian death toll in Gaza, which had already begun, although much, much less than obviously today. But in any case, he said that if the imam were to denounce the attack on October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israeli civilians, that would cause many in his own mosque to openly rebel. Well, I understood that political consideration, but I confess my gut feeling on when I heard that was, well, look, if an imam who we've worked so long with and has been a friend now can't speak about the mass murder of Jews for fear of negative reaction in his community, what good is he to us?
Walter, I denounce what Hamas did on October 7. It goes against Islamic law. The rules of warfare are very clear. Do not hurt civilians. Do not hurt women. Do not hurt the children and elderly, and do not destroy homes and civilian property. And you do not take civilians as hostages. We in the Muslim community want to hear American Jews speak out and denounce Israeli government's relentless bombardment of Gaza. Not statements, but action. I would like to see my Jewish brethren call upon their elected officials and register their objection to the killing of civilians, women, and children, and pressure the Israeli government to stop the killing of the innocent, stop the bombing of homes, stop the displacement of women and children, and object to the desecration of cemeteries and the stripping of men. It will mean something to elected officials when American Jews lodge their objection. Now, having said that, I applaud the courage of many American Jews, like the Jewish Voice for Peace, officials in the State Department and USAID, who have resigned stating, "Not in my name," and many others who have spoken, protested, and campaigned for an end to the carnage. I pray for the safe return of the hostages, as I do for the starving Palestinians and children who have been injured, maimed, and orphaned. Okay, now I want to talk about anti-Semitism. There is a visceral belief in the Muslim community that the term anti-Semitism is being weaponized to censor and silence criticism of the Israeli government's actions in Gaza and beyond. Anti-Semitism is a terrible sentiment and deserves to be denounced. But if it is applied to any criticism of Israeli government's policies, it will dilute its potency. Criticizing Israeli politicians is just that, a criticism of politicians. It is not a criticism of the Jewish community at large. I would like to see American Jews call out those who misapply the term. Otherwise, it will lead to resentment and a further increase in anti-Semitism.
Well, Sabia, first, thanks so much for your clear statement on October 7th. That means a lot to me. And I also want to say that I agree with you that the weaponization of anti-Semitism in recent months to shut down debate is wrong-headed and is often being pushed forward by political forces intent on driving our communities apart for their own political benefit. One very prominent example, Representative Elise Stefanik and her successful gotcha attack that forced the resignation of the presidents of UPenn and Harvard, even though there was no evidence that students on those campuses were calling for genocides against Jews, which she claimed. She said, she demanded that the presidents make a statement against it, and they very sensibly said, but it's not happening. But it was a gotcha kind of a thing, and it sent, and the effect of it was it forced the resignation of the two presidents and sent a chilling signal about academic freedom on campuses across America. And so, having been successful with that, Stefanik and other Republicans followed that up last month with a hearing by pressuring the president of Columbia, actually it was in April, to crack down on the student encampment there. Which she then did, and then that set off a chain reaction, leading universities across the countries to close down their encampments. Now, the truth is that the mainstream Jewish community has also spearheaded some of these efforts, which I believe is utterly wrong-headed, as I said, and self-defeating for the Jewish community. History shows us that Jews stood bravely against sometimes mainstream opinion, repressive opinions during the McCarthy period, and they played a major role in fighting for civil rights for African Americans and opposing the Vietnam War during the 60s. So we know from history that Jews do not thrive well under censorship. Yet in seeking to understand the mainstream Jewish community's response and stance today, um, and assertion that anti-Zionism or even criticism of Israeli treatment of the Palestinians is tantamount to anti-Semitism, it is important to comprehend the great hurt in the Jewish community and even a sense of abandonment and betrayal that longtime allies, including in the Muslim community, have hardly mentioned the horrendous and gruesome mass murder of the 1,200 Israelis on October 7th. Now, the Hamas attack showed clear genocidal intent, making clear that Hamas would slaughter every Jew in Israel if they had the means. And despite that, Muslims accuse Israel of committing genocide in Gaza without mentioning Hamas's actions, which precipitated the whole thing. I would just very much like to hear from Muslim leaders and activists what you just said, a clear denunciation of the massacre undertaken by Hamas as a violation of fundamental Islamic precepts.
Walter, I would like the Jewish community to demand that the powers that be address the root cause of the conflict. Killing and wiping out Hamas isn't going to solve the problem. If Palestinians can meet their necessities like food, water, a home, a job, and a life of dignity, are self-reliant, and are not under constant siege, Hamas will die. Militant movements emerge when people are desperate. We know that. So unless the desperation and misery of the Palestinians are addressed, another Hamas-like entity will emerge. So address the root cause, the humanitarian issue. Terrorism will die a natural death. I would like to see the Jewish community call it out when pro-Palestinian voices are dealt with unjustly. Excuse me. For example, doxing of students on campuses by potential employers and threatened with professional consequences. For example, writers and speakers getting cancelled and fired from jobs for posting pro-Palestinian statements on social media. For example, surveillance of pro-Palestinian student protesters when their photos are plastered on trucks, their home addresses publicized, death threats issued, assaults, harassment, and bullying, visits by the FBI, and tarred as pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, or Hamas sympathizers. Excuse me. For example, unleashing riot police on peaceful protesters on campuses. For example, universities are being pressured to shut down Jewish Voices for Peace, Students for Justice in Palestine. Columbia has already done that, and shutting down some Muslim student associations. For example, 13 students at Harvard were barred from graduating. For example, a Muslim TV anchorman is cancelled. And one last point. Demand from the US government that they lift the embargo of food and humanitarian assistance by the UNRWA. Palestinian women and children are starving. Demand that they stop the unconditional funding of offensive weapons to Israel. We are aiding and abetting a massacre.
Sabia, in conclusion, as we'll see, some of the expectations that you and I have articulated now from both sides are unrealistic and counterproductive if those expectations are set as a precondition for reconciliation between the two communities. Nevertheless, the expectations represent a political reality that cannot be lightly dispensed with.
So we have talked about understanding how each side feels and what each side expects from the other. As we can see, the two perspectives are sharply divergent with little apparent overlap. Nevertheless, our goal is to bring the communities back into a mode where communication and cooperation are again possible. So, how do we achieve that? Where do we go from here?
Well, where we go from here is to talk about what we as Americans can do to keep the peace here at home. So tune into our next episode, what Muslims and Jews can do to reconcile and keep the peace at home.
Thank you for tuning in. Be well, be safe, and prayers for peace and reconciliation.
Thanks so much, Sabia. Thank you to everyone.